Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 23. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent BJJ approach. Today, we're talking about coaching and team building. There's different experiences that Matt and I have had on this topic, but since this is Matt's full-time job, I think it's probably good to let you do most of the heavy lifting on this one, Matt.
All right.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about coaching strategies in the past, particularly strategies for learning and mental models for social situations, but I think this is an important enough topic that we can actually do a full episode on it. So hopefully this is something that you guys find useful. There are a lot of different ways that coaching and team building are relevant to jiu-jitsu. Maybe we can talk about some of the different contexts where this comes up. Matt, I guess the first thing is becoming a coach. You know, most of us start off jiu-jitsu just doing jiu-jitsu, and then at some point we kind of evolve into this teacher role, and that can be different depending on what direction you take. But at the bare minimum, you're probably providing some degree of knowledge to the more junior people in class. Going above and beyond that, you know, you might actually take over some degree of teaching. You might do one-on-ones. At the bare minimum, you're probably giving pointers to the people in class. And of course, you know, it gets to the point too where if you're really involved, you can be coaching at tournaments and teaching seminars as well. Matt, maybe we can talk about that initial transition though, going from a practitioner to a coach. What do you think is really kind of the steps that you have to take to go down that road? You know, what are the things that you would look for in someone to say that, you know, you've kind of gone beyond practitioner level and you now have the attributes that would make you a coach?
I mean, it's a great question. And, you know, us both being black belts, we definitely have gone through this transition where, you know, at one point you were just trying to struggle to survive. And then as you reach the purple brown belt levels, you start becoming somewhat of a mentor to people in the class. And, you know, by osmosis, you kind of become that coach figure. Even if you're, you know, strictly a competitor or whatever, you're still kind of... you're there to help in a small way, right? I don't know many higher level ranks that aren't expected or don't embrace the role of helping in the classroom with some of the lower ranks, even if being an instructor isn't really your priority. But I would say that the qualities that someone would need to display for to become a high-ranked coach or, you know, one of the more senior people in the class that's going to take an instructing role. I mean, I think the first thing is consistency. I want to see someone who's there, you know, at least 5-6 days a week, if possible, because you know that they're really living the jiu-jitsu lifestyle. They're really thinking about it. Even when they're at home, they do some studying. They love the sport. They probably already work another job, and you know, they're trying to fit in time to train every day as well as working, you know, a full job. And I've done that before and it's really hard. So definitely someone who's consistent and really embraces the jiu-jitsu life is someone that I would want first as a coach. And obviously there's the character traits like, you know, being personable, being kind, outgoing, knowledgeable, willing to share the knowledge. All these things, they all add up to someone who would be a fantastic instructor. And yeah, of course, like I said, personable, someone who's, you know, not intimidating to be around, but, and of course, on the technical side, needs to be comprehensive with jiu-jitsu, needs to be able to teach jiu-jitsu. And this never used to be a standard for me before when I was a purple belt because I didn't know, but the alignment concepts and lever mechanic concepts and everything like that, for me, those have to be a prerequisite now for anyone that I want to teach.
So something that we talked about in earlier episodes was how once you become one of the more senior people in your gym, you get a lot of benefit by raising the level in the room. When you're one of the more junior people, you can absorb information like a sponge from everyone you're training with. But when you become more senior, it is in your best interests to encourage the growth of the people around you, because that's going to result in them giving you more resistance, which is going to make you better at jiu-jitsu. And to me, that realization is one of the important things that means you're on the way to becoming a coach. You know, once you start realizing that you could theoretically get more in investing the people around you than you would in investing just in yourself. That kind of understanding of, you know, contributing back to the team is one of the things that, from a mindset standpoint, I think means you're on the path to becoming a coach.
Yeah, of course, there's going to be people out there who are strictly competitors and don't have an interest in being an instructor, just like there's people who have no interest in competing and enjoy instructing. I think that to have the best understanding of jiu-jitsu, part of that requires you to also be able to pass the knowledge on. And for me, jiu-jitsu is my job. I have a true passion for instruction and also competing, but I understand that's not natural for everyone. But like you said, investing in your own team and building your team up, building up the people around you, not only does it make you feel really great and fulfilled, but it also does raise the level in the room. So as a competitor, you'll benefit, and you're basically creating an investment in the people around you, and it helps you in the end.
And another thing when it comes to coaching, this doesn't mean that you necessarily need to be a formal instructor of the class if you're coaching. Coaching can just be a casual one-on-one thing where you help people learn. This can be as simple as someone asks you a question and you answer it, right? Coaching can establish more formal roles where you take on teaching responsibilities, but anyone, regardless of their experience level, has the capacity to be a coach if they're interested in doing so. And I think it's inevitable that at some point you're going to get some exposure with this kind of educational experience in jiu-jitsu. It just comes down to how much of that responsibility you want to take on as part of your training.
Yeah, and there's no doubt for me that becoming an instructor myself and becoming a teacher helped me understand jiu-jitsu way better. It really helped progress my game as a practitioner and as a competitor. And I find the same thing happens for my students when they start to acquire enough knowledge and experience that they can now pass information on. I see really great improvements in their game as well. So, you really want to make sure that your students aren't just good at jiu-jitsu. They're not just good at competing, but that they can efficiently and correctly pass on the knowledge to other people.
It reminds me of that quote from Einstein where if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. And I think that's very applicable to jiu-jitsu. There are a lot of situations where you might think that you understand how something works in jiu-jitsu, but when you have to try to explain it to someone, you really struggle because it's hard to put it to words. And usually that means that you don't fully understand it to the extent that you could. This is one of the benefits of teaching, is that it forces you to think things through from the bottom up. And that can be a really good learning opportunity. It can force you to approach things that you've taken for granted from a new angle. Sometimes I realize things about techniques or strategies that I never thought of before simply because someone asked me a question. And in trying to answer the question, I had to think things through in a level of depth that I normally don't, right? Yeah. When you've trained something and drilled something so many times, eventually it gets to the point where you're not thinking about it anymore, which is good. That's what you want. You want to be able to drill this stuff into your muscle memory. But the problem is once you've kind of drilled something into your muscle memory, it means that a lot of the time you're not really actively thinking about what you're doing anymore. And sometimes that denies you the opportunity to kind of add new details or punch holes in your game. And that's where teaching actually can really help, because it does force you to go back and analyze that stuff, especially if your students are good enough to ask you questions like, why did you just do that, right? I love that question because sometimes the answer is, I don't know why I just did that. Yeah. Maybe that wasn't actually a good thing for me to do.
Yeah, one of my pleasures as being a teacher is having students question why I would teach something a certain way, or why I like to do something this way. What's my thoughts on this? It really, forces you to break down everything and sort of reanalyze why we do things. And as a result, pretty much the only result, as long as you don't have an ego, is improvements are to be made. If you're one of those people that hates being questioned and, you think that you know everything, I mean, you're probably not a high-level instructor.
Yeah, or even honestly, a high-level practitioner, I would say, right? I mean, if you don't have that kind of beginner's mind where you're open to feedback and open to learning, it's going to hinder your growth in anything, but it's going to be especially difficult for you to succeed as a coach or instructor. Red flag for me is when someone is teaching something and they are absolutely 100% confident in the conviction of what they're saying, and they think they have the answer to everything. Or you ask them a question or challenge them, and they just think it's ridiculous that this technique might not work, right? Some instructors do that, where they just seem so confident in what they're saying that, it seems like they're just talking like this move is an inevitability, and there's no way that they could be missing a detail or misunderstanding something. Or you ask them, well, what if the person does this? And they say, oh, that would never work, or something like that, right? Someone who has a beginner's mind and is inquisitive and curious about learning should always be willing to have their ideas challenged. And one of the benefits of being a coach is you open yourself up to a situation where a room full of people want to challenge your ideas. And that can make you a lot better at the end of the day. But as a good coach, I think it's critical to cultivate that beginner's mind in yourself and in your students so that everyone is curious and wants to learn and ask questions.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, when I was first becoming an instructor, I think it was a purple belt when I started actually teaching classes. This was way before I knew about posture, structure, base, frames, levers, all the main concepts that really build up the foundation of my game and my instruction now. When I was new to teaching, I was just honestly, every class, I was just trying not to sound like a complete jackass. You're trying not to be embarrassed, and you're worried about little things like that. Yeah. Now, I've had times where I'm teaching class now, and I have a few really good white. Now they're blue belts, but I'll teach something, and then after they'll be like, "Hey Matt, what do you think of this?" And they add on to the technique. And when we meet up for the next technique, I'm like, "Okay, we all got to talk about this for a sec because so and so just pointed out this." They just pointed out this detail that I think is really important that I missed or whatever. So having that, where you truly don't have an ego and you don't let somebody's suggestions or question disrupt the learning lesson, you can really learn from anyone, right? Mm-hmm. And if you can look at it instead of being, trying not to get embarrassed, to you're all just there to learn together, and you take the role that nobody knows everything completely, it's a lot more less stressful for everyone, and it's a lot more fun to be an instructor when you're like that. You definitely don't want to go into an instruction and think that you need to have all the answers. You need to have a perfect lesson plan. You got to stick to a tight schedule. Truthfully, being a good instructor means that you can adapt on the fly. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the time when I'll think about what I want to teach that evening or that week, and then I go in and the level of the room is completely different from what I had envisioned in my mind. So now on the fly, right before class, I have to adjust things. I want to do different warm-up drills because there's certain people in the class that are newer, or I feel like I can do something else that's more advanced because I see that other people have shown up. So, going in with a concrete lesson plan isn't always the best strategy if you're new to instruction, but you definitely have to have some idea of what you want to teach and then be able to adapt on the fly. It's a lot like jiu-jitsu, basically.
Yeah, it's like the quote, you want to have a plan, but you want to know that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? It's exactly the same here. What I've also heard that presentation is 10% preparation and 90% theater, and I think that's absolutely the case. It's not about having the perfect game plan documented for your class. It's about being able to adapt on the fly to the needs of the people in the room. It's the same if you're doing public speaking or giving a presentation. It's the exact same when you're teaching a class. And I think that one of the big breakthroughs you need to have from a mindset standpoint is understanding that the role of a good coach is not to be the fountain of knowledge. Like your job is not to be the guy who knows everything. Your job is to be a facilitator of learning. That doesn't mean you know everything. You might not know anything, but it means that your job is to manage the conversation about how learning happens and get that information or figure it out alongside the people in the class. You might not be the one with the answers, but your job is to work with the class to find those answers. Or if you can't, then to get back to them next time. And that could be hard to do, right? Because our egos don't want us to admit that we don't know something, especially when we're supposed to be the instructor. That's why, this comes down to psychological safety, right? We want to have an environment where everyone feels confident asking questions. They know you're not going to be made fun of or shot down. Everyone knows that it's okay to not know things. This is a very important dynamic for any sort of team structure, where you never want to have a group where people are afraid to ask questions because they think they're going to be made fun of or they're going to get defensive apprehensive. You want to have a room where people are willing to, in a friendly way, challenge ideas for the purpose of coming up with the best answer together. That's super important as an instructor. And one of the things I like about jiu-jitsu is we don't really, well, at some point we do, but we don't really generally use terms like master, right? Like I don't call my instructor master.
Some people do.
Some people do. And I mean, to be fair, once you get to red and black, you're supposed to. But generally speaking, we say, coach or professor or, maybe crazy idea, just call a person by their name, right?
Yeah.
We don't really have that kind of like authoritative structure in jiu-jitsu. And that's one of the things that I think jiu-jitsu does very well. If you're expected to be a master, it's very hard for you to admit that you don't know anything because you feel like you're not living up to the label. But if you're a coach, it's a lot easier to admit that you're not perfect.
Yeah, and I think professor is actually Portuguese for teacher. I could be wrong about that, but I don't insist that people call me professor or coach. I mean, kids is one thing because I think that you're teaching kids discipline at that age. You're trying to instill character and certain values. So I understand kids addressing you by a certain title, but I feel that there's something pretentious about making parents and your adult students call you master, or master I think is the most pretentious one.
Yeah.
Also professor and sir and coach and things like that. I mean, we're all adults here. It's a business, but then again, my school's not super formal. There's lots of schools that are really formal. Different martial arts are more formal. So I understand that there is a cultural difference there. Mm-hmm. And I definitely expect more discipline out of my kids than I do out of my adult students.
Yeah, I understand that to some people, the structured discipline of certain martial arts is very helpful to them, but I honestly find it kind of distracting, and I'm never really a fan of giving someone like an honorific that implies they're better than you, right? Calling someone like master is like that's just kind of gross, really, honestly. It's adults.
You're a racist.
Adults shouldn't think about people in that manner, right? You shouldn't. It's crazy, especially to call someone master just because they've got a lot of practice pajama wrestling, like really for crying out loud. Like,
even professor.
Yeah, even professor is a bit like I really prefer to work with people and not rank or authority, right? Even the belt system, I think, is a little bit much. I personally find that people are more likely to open up and ask questions and contribute to the group if you don't have people who are hiding behind rank or authority. And so in that sense, I personally don't like the whole professor thing. I mean, that said, I prefer it over master, but I find that it can be a distraction, and it can kind of, I worry sometimes that it prevents people from really engaging with the group because they feel there's this like power structure that they can't go against.
Yeah, and it reinforces that power structure. Whereas I'd rather be in a training environment where it's more like a group of friends, or even, if you want to use the word family, you can, but I mean, it's not really a family. It's a business where people are paying money to learn. Right? It's a team.
Yeah.
And an organic team where everyone's on the same level, I find is much more enjoyable than an atmosphere where I'm the master, you're the student, and I'm on a different level from you. Because I find it's an unnecessary hierarchy that is established and enforced.
Yeah, so. And even just from a selfish perspective, having that kind of hierarchy is going to hinder your growth because people won't question you. And as we've already established repeatedly, if you're not challenged and confronted with difficult situations, you don't have growth opportunities. So you really need people to be willing to ask questions of you. And we've talked in the past about how jiu-jitsu is at its best when it's like a laboratory. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I think professor is kind of it's a better title than some of the alternatives. But I think that the less hierarchy you've got, the more likely you are to have people treat the art like a laboratory.
Yeah. And back to what you were saying about being a teacher is sort of, what did you say? 10%?
10% preparation, 90% theater.
Yeah, that's great. The way Rob talks about it is being an instructor, it is a presentation, right? You go do a seminar, it's a presentation. You go teach a class, it's a presentation. It's even more so when you're teaching the kids because you do have to be a bit more theatrical and you really have to simplify things, right? So being an instructor, the goal isn't to give them all the information. In fact, that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of instructors make. I used to make that that problem, I'd go and teach a class and we're doing way too many techniques, right? It's more important to know how much to give the students. Don't give them so much that they can't remember anything. Structure it in such a way that the knowledge gets retained within the students. Make sure that you can be that medium that transfers the knowledge to your students effectively. And the way Rob deals with it is, if people in here don't get something, it's not your fault. It's my fault for not portraying that information to you in such a way that you can absorb it, right? And sometimes you'll see practitioners or competitors that are amazing in competition, but as instructors, they lack a lot of crucial traits that allow them to be really successful instructors. And you see this a lot. You see this with some of the highest level grapplers in the world. And it comes down to not only the understanding of mechanics and concepts, but the actual presentation of being an instructor. And sometimes language barrier does play its role as well. But definitely there's a difference between being really good at jiu-jitsu and being really good at teaching jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, I think what you've described there is a very important takeaway whenever you need to teach someone something complicated. You need to understand that you can't give people all of the information all at once and expect them to process it. You need to you need to kind of do this in layers and in steps. We talked in the past about incremental learning, where, people aren't computers. You can't just copy and paste all of this knowledge from my brain to yours. I might need to take baby steps. I might need to start off with just the very simplest ideas. And then at some point, I'm going to start to see the limitations of the move myself and encounter issues myself. And that's when I'm ready for the next step. We had a seminar actually yesterday with my instructor, and it was kind of funny because it was a group of people that he wasn't super familiar with. So he didn't really know exactly what the level in the room was. And we started off by talking about, one particular move. And then he realized, okay, we've got to dial this down a little bit and talk about something more fundamental. So we started talking about framing and using your hips. And then after a few minutes of that, he realized, okay, well, we're going to have to adjust this again. Let's just go back even further and talk about something even more fundamental, like how to pin somebody. And that kind of thinking requires you to be able to pay attention to what's happening in the room and adjust your lesson on the fly, so that the people who are there are going to get the most benefit out of what you're presenting. Because if you're at step 10 and people are still struggling at step 1, you're wasting everyone's time. There's no shame in going back and covering basics or fundamentals, even if people should technically already know these things, right? Or at least you think they should. I mean, in this example I'm giving, this was a room full of black, brown, purple belts. And still, we were going over base fundamental stuff because we felt that there was something to get out of it. So that's really important to understand when you're teaching, is you've got to monitor what your students are absorbing, and if they're at the level where they can absorb the kind of complexity you're presenting. And
I also think there's something to be said about if you're the main instructor overlooking everything. We've discussed in the past about how it's kind of you kind of have to make the sacrifice in this case, because people are getting their repetitions and you're just kind of watching. You can't really do the repetitions and still have eyes on everyone, right? It's hard enough to watch everyone. You can usually only come around to a few different pairs at a time. You can't watch the whole class, but you certainly can't do that if you're trying to get repetitions yourself. So being an instructor does involve a level of sacrifice, where you're going to sacrifice your own experience and repetitions for other people to enjoy. And definitely, walking around is something I say is really important, because I think one of the last things you want to do as an instructor is sit in one area of the room near the same people and just watch them drill while other people are, they could be missing crucial details. So you do have to move around the room, see who's getting it, who's not getting it. And then, add your criticisms when you may. And another thing is, if I see people doing a technique, do I stop them right then and there and correct them, or do I let them screw it up notice that maybe several people are making this mistake, regroup after the, maybe we're drilling a technique for 5 minutes, and then I see this mistake keeps happening over and over and over again. Do I stop them in the middle of the timer and tell them to do it differently this way, or should I wait until after the timer's done, then regroup as a class, talk about what went wrong collectively, and then do another 5 minutes on top so that people can make adjustments? So there's, as an instructor, I used to try to correct people on the spot. As soon as I'd see something wrong, I'd correct it. And I found out, man, I'm doing a lot of correcting. Like I feel like I'm probably becoming annoying to some of these people. So I started just letting people make the mistakes. Let them make the mistakes. See if they can figure it out on their own. And then incremental learning comes in, and I layer in the new details again. And hopefully when we do it the next time, they've made adjustments.
Yeah, the trick is not to like spoon feed information to people like they're babies.
You don't want to nitpick necessarily.
You give them enough information that they can hit the roadblock. Like there's always a roadblock, right? So you give them enough information that they hit the wall and the limits of what they can do with that knowledge. So eventually they're going to hit some what if scenario or something they're struggling with. And once they start to feel that struggle, that means it's time for the next bit of information. So rather than you just parceling out information step by step, you kind of have to wait to see when people are ready for that next level. And the sign they're ready for that next level of info is you start to see that struggle in them where they're kind of like getting frustrated that they can't do it. And that means they're ready and receptive and they understand why they now need this next step. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a bit about teaching, in a class dynamic. Matt, from your perspective, in a one-on-one situation, so this doesn't necessarily mean when you're doing a private even, but if you're rolling with someone and you want to contribute and help them, is there anything different in that situation versus how you would do things in a group setting, or are they fundamentally the same from your perspective?
I mean, fundamentally, the jiu-jitsu and the concepts stay the same. All the alignment concepts, posture, structure, base, frames, wedges, levers, that's the filter that I run every question through. Every problem, every situation where I'm unclear about something, I run it through that filter and I look for the free lever, I look for the broken alignment, and that's it. Pretty much every time gives me the answer that is most obvious. That's why it's such a great system to have. If you haven't used this already, please check out our alignment, on the database and also on the episodes that we've talked about alignment. Again, it's something we're going to just forever mention because it's such a valuable tool. But the jiu-jitsu stays the same. But when you're one-on-one with someone, you're no longer pandering to a whole group. It's more now that you're paying attention to the problem that one person is giving you. So maybe they have a specific question about, why is my guard getting passed, or the classic one, what's a good escape from side control? I mean, really, let's talk about what's causing the problem. The real problem is you're getting your guard passed. And usually that begins in the engagement phase, right? Which we've discussed so many times. So winning the engagement phase battle will later on pay dividends when it comes time to escaping bad positions, because you prevent those bad positions from happening. As an instructor, when I'm asked a question one-on-one from a student, I need to assess the problem, and I need to assess the cause of the problem. Then I need to think about what are some steps that we can come up with moving forward that are going to put the person on the right track to getting some actual results and preventing these problems from continuously happening, or maybe I'm going for these leg locks and I, my partner always escapes. Well, let's put me in the 411 and show me your wedges are off. That's why. What about, are you going for the heel hook right away? Well, you're not controlling the free leg. So as a result, I'm allowed to get in base. I'm allowed to spin out of this position and escape. So if you do the proper wedging and you control the free leg, you're in a position of control. Now we can start to get the leg lock. So working things backwards sometimes one-on-one is really sometimes, I think, the best way to expose holes in your game, in the person's game, and then come up with solutions. Yeah.
I think another thing to use in your toolbox when you're teaching on an individual level, you can pay a lot more attention to the learning style of the person that you're training with. Whereas within a group, you're kind of limited because, everyone has different learning styles, and you can't really cater to this when you're talking to a group of 20 people at once. But when you're working with someone on a one-on-one basis, you need to understand exactly how that person is best suited learning, and understand that not everyone is going to learn best by drilling the same thing dozens of times, right? I mean, for me personally, I learn best when I talk things through and I think about things. Like I don't think everyone is like this, but if you ask me to just drill something 100 times, I won't necessarily get better at it. But if you spend 5 minutes just sitting down and explaining something to me and letting me ask questions and answering it, then a lot of the time I can pull the technique off the first time. Like it's something where it's kind of like a more analytical approach, where some people are more visual learners, some people are more oral learners, some people are kinetic learners. They have to do things, and some people need to think things through. Like there's a lot of different ways to learn, and you never want to assume that the person you're talking to is going to learn best the same way that you learned. This is something that you need to, if the person is struggling with the approach you're taking, maybe try a different approach, or you could even start asking them questions to kind of pry more information about their mindset out of their head, rather than them asking you a question and you feeling forced to provide an answer. You can turn it around and ask them questions about what feels right, what feels wrong, what they're struggling with. And that's the best way, I think, a lot of the time to know how to serve that person most effectively.
Yeah, creating, and we'll talk about this, I think we're going to talk about teaching kids pretty quickly here.
Yeah.
Creating a dialogue between the instructor and the class is a really great way to keep people focused. And especially I find with children, it's really good, because when you're teaching kids, you're not just teaching them martial arts, you're teaching them to listen. Can you stand on a wall for 3 minutes and listen to instruction? And then I'll ask, okay, I want someone to demonstrate what I just shown. And then it's amazing how many kids weren't actually listening, right? So from then on, sometimes it sets sort of a trigger in the kid's head that, hey, I might get quizzed on this later. I better listen up, because I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm talking about. Same thing for adults. I like to ask questions. I'll be showing something and I'll say, okay, who can tell me why I would want to put my head here? Or who can tell me where my base is right now? Or which way could I possibly be swept? And then now we're reverse engineering the posture, structure, base concepts into the students so that they can actually identify it on their own. If you can do that, then essentially they'll be able to plug that into hopefully any scenario, and then use it as an ongoing tool. You're trying to teach them how to fish. Like you said, you don't really want to spoon feed them the information.
They need to come to you asking what, if I give you 10 answers and I say, here's step 1, here's an answer. Step 2, here's an answer. Step 3, here's an answer. That's kind of overwhelming and without context. But if I give you step 1 and then you come back to me with a question, then you're ready for me to give you step 2. And it means that the learning dialogue is back and forth rather than one directional. And that's always going to be more effective.
For sure.
Yeah. It's almost kind of in some ways like, it's not really Socratic learning, right? Socratic learning is when you basically ask, you kind of use questions as a basis to learn. But in this case, it's like you're trying to get the other person to want to ask that question. Yeah. You want to let them feel the pain caused by the limits of their knowledge.
Yes.
And then you want them to start asking you questions. And you need to draw that out of them, because that kind of inquisitiveness, first of all, it's just good learning habit, but also it means that person is more likely to be interested in and retain that knowledge once you give it to them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. In terms of one-on-one situations, anything else, Matt, that you want to add on that topic in terms of like how to deal with people from a one-on-one basis?
I find one-on-one is always, in a way, it's easier than teaching in class, because you can focus your information, you can focus your attention on one person. But in another way, like if it's a private,
I think it's harder.
It could also be quite difficult, because now you're on the spot. You really have to, especially when people are paying you for your time. The last thing I want is for someone to do a private with me and then come away thinking that it wasn't worth it, or that I didn't help them. Right. So
well, not just that, but I find that in one-on-one situations, you tend to go into a lot more depth, right? Because you're basically going down the rabbit hole with that person.
Yes.
When you're in a group setting, you normally there's one high level thing that you want everyone to achieve. But when you're catering to one person, they might take things in a very different direction. If you start asking me about like instep guard or something, yeah, maybe I can answer your question. But if we keep going down that road, we might wind up talking about single leg X, or leg drag sweeps, or weird things that I didn't expect to be talking about. So there's a level of depth that you can get into when you're dealing with an individual person versus a group. For that reason, I find it's often more challenging to deal with just one-on-one, because it's not just like a question and answer, but it's a series of questions that tend to come up that build on the previous one, and you wind up kind of like building a tower of knowledge in this one meeting with a person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one-on-one, you can definitely, I think you can cover far more knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So on that topic, I mean, you alluded to this earlier, Matt, but when it comes to coaching children, now, other than having a child, I'm not particularly an expert in coaching children in a jiu-jitsu standpoint, but I know that you've been doing this for a while. Let's talk about this a bit. Like, what is different when you're coaching children versus coaching adults?
I think the main thing that's different is just the attention spans is the main difference. When you're teaching a room full of adults, they're there to learn. They're paying you to learn. They want to learn. They want the knowledge. When you're teaching kids,
the parents are paying. The parents want the kids to learn. The parents want the knowledge.
Exactly. Like a lot of the time, they don't want to be there, and it can be a struggle, especially for some kids, to keep them motivated. They do a few reps and then they just literally lie there limp, or they're in the middle of a match or a middle of a sparring session and then they just give up on you, right? It's your job as a coach to constantly push them along, constantly keep them motivated, and keep them moving, honestly, from a physical point of view and from a hypothetical point of view. And it can be really tough because teaching children, you need to shave the level of details probably by 75% as compared to adults.
Yeah, it's a good example of incremental learning. When you're dealing with children, you have to start with just the base level information, and you have to understand that you're dealing with a child, right? Someone who might not have the attention span or the ability to think at a complex level so that they can understand these really difficult concepts. You got to be willing to give them what they can handle.
Yeah, kids learn at such an amazing rate, and they're like little sponges, but at the same time, they still don't have the same awareness or coordination as most adults. So they're still learning how to move, learning, some kids I say, put your right arm here and grab the collar, they look at me like I'm speaking a totally different language. And then some kids get it right away. So the main thing to take away I find with the kids is, at least at the junior levels, is fundamentals and basics are the key. It's not about teaching them all these different types of guards and things like that. We need to teach them base posture structure, how to frame, how to move our hips, how to do proper break fall, how to do forward roll. Ideally, eventually learning how to invert, even though that's pretty difficult for a child to learn, but rolls and things like that. And keeping it more basic, I find is you get a lot more out of that. And then once they build that foundation and over a few years of training, then you can start getting into the really interesting stuff with the kids. But definitely keeping things like details to a minimum and letting the kids make mistakes is a really big part of their development. It's just like if you're a parent and your schedule is so full with your kid, you put them in like 3 different sports. They always have something to do every day. I don't think that's really good for the kids. I think it's good for a kid to have time to be bored, have time to have thoughts to themselves, have time to just be free and to play and to have to just think and not just be constantly rushing doing stuff.
Oh man, I've got so many thoughts on these topics here. I mean, my first thought, of course, is if you're teaching your kids about like levers and wedges at that age, they're going to kick ass when they get to grade 9 and they have to do science. They're going to be so ready for that.
Well, how many kids learn about posture? Like we tell kids to stand up straight.
We don't explain why.
We don't explain why. We don't explain that when you do sports, your body, there's going to be the most effective position for your limbs and your spine for every position. That standing up straight has so much more to do with efficiency and effectiveness, not just because we're trying to be strict on you, but it literally portrays confidence and shows that you're that you're ready to take on tasks, and it really sends a lot through your body language to future employers, things like that. So I think kids should learn about posture structure and base and for any sport that they do, and just moving forward in life.
Well, interestingly, actually, this is a powerful psychological model. It's not really something that comes up that much in the context of jiu-jitsu, but it is true that your actions kind of precede your mindset. Like if you want to have a certain mindset or think or feel a certain way, the best thing to do is to create the actions that basically simulate that behavior, because it will come naturally from there. So a common example of this, of course, is I think everyone knows that if you habitually smile, you will be more happier than if you don't. Like the actual act of smiling changes your mindset. And it's similar with posture, right? If you have good posture, in addition to making you better at jiu-jitsu, it's also going to have the impact of allowing you to project with more confidence. It'll prevent like back problems in the future as well, right? And these are things that you always want to make sure that you're explaining to kids so it doesn't just sound like a bunch of grown-ups telling them what to do. And when you're dealing with kids, I mean, look, I'm not going to tell you how to raise your kids, except that I absolutely am.
Except this is my podcast.
Yeah. So, when we're talking about how we should respect people above their positions, put people before their positions, that applies to you as a parent as well, right? Like if you really are a good parent, you should be teaching your kid to treat everyone with respect and also expect that respect back from other people. And that means that, you shouldn't be yelling at your kid. You shouldn't be freaking out at your kid. You should be able to explain to your kid why your kid should be doing something. You should be willing to negotiate with your kid and answer your kid's questions. And that means that, especially if you're in a difficult situation, like if you're coaching a bunch of kids, you don't want to be that instructor who's like yelling at kids or is losing his composure. If you are losing your composure because of children, you have to ask yourself who's the real child in the room. Because look, if you're not able to control your emotions, then maybe the kids aren't the one who are children, right? Maybe it's you. You need to set that example and show them that you're in control of your emotions and teach them to be in control of their emotions. Because kids are they're going to learn from you, right? If you're not acting like an adult, you can't expect them to act like an adult either. And
definitely when I go and teach kids, my whole thing that I keep telling myself is I'm here to teach them jiu-jitsu, they're going to teach me patience. So it's a two-way street, and I've learned so much about being a father and being a coach through coaching children. It's a really it's a fulfilling thing, and it is really frustrating at times, but from an instructor's point of view, it really has benefited me a lot. And I can understand how people that are really new to the sport and new to sports, how they learn different things and little tricks that I can do, little games that I can play to help them learn. It's a really fascinating topic to think about, but definitely they're all going to learn at different rates, and you can only go through so much at a time. Usually in a 45-minute kids class, I only teach one technique usually. The rest is filled up with basically live sparring, drills, and then usually a game at the end. So when you're teaching kids, I also have to say that you have to set rewards as well, and there's also got to be consequences for things like lack of motivation, or if they not being respectful or acting out, then there has to be consequences for that. You can't just let them get away with it. And then, if everyone trains really well, you have to double down and make sure that they really know that you're impressed with them, that you're proud that they tried hard. You give them that constructive, that positive feedback, and then you reward them with a game.
Yeah. And the thing to bear in mind here too is that when you do, when you do impose rules and restrictions and punishments like this, they have to be reasonable, agreed upon, consistent, and they have to be something that makes sense, right? If you're just a rampant disciplinarian, you don't want a situation where kids are afraid of you because you're the authority. They need to understand why these rules are in place. They need to understand that the rules apply consistently to everybody, and they need to understand why the rule, they need to some extent agree to the rules as well, right? It is a negotiation, even though they're children. I'm reminded of the golden rule, right? You treat others the way that they want to be treated. The thing is, a lot of the time with children, people kind of forget that children are people too. They're just at a different developmental stage. But all of these mental models that we've discussed apply to children just as well as adults, right? And you've got to, have some empathy and put yourself in this kid's shoes, right? They've been deposited at this martial arts school that they may not even want to be at. They probably had other things that they wanted to do with their day. They don't know anyone there. They're being asked to do things that are confusing. They may be intimidated. They're not at the physical developmental stage where they might even be able to do the things that they're being asked to do. Same with, cognitive capacity. So you've got to put yourself in their shoes and understand that, they might not be getting difficult because they want to piss you off or anything. It could just be that, this is a lot to put on someone who's 3 to 4 to 5 years old, right? And it's something that you have to have empathy about if you want the kids to really respect you, right? You have to treat them like they're people.
And, there is, call me, I don't know what you want to call me. I feel like teaching boys and girls there are distinct differences between the sexes. I find that girls are really good at following directions. They listen. They really try hard. They try to make you proud as an instructor. They want that feedback. Whereas boys, a lot of the time, they just go and do whatever they want. They're hard to keep the attention span. And you know what? I know it's the exact same thing inside of school too. Like in classrooms, boys generally want to play and roughhouse, and girls, you know, are more interested in following directions and doing well and impressing the instructor. So you do have to have patience for the boys, and you also have to engage both boys and girls, you know, where both of them are going to have a good time. They're not going to fear you. Like you said, that's one of the main things too. I know kids that have left from other schools, and they said that their last instructor was really mean, is what they said. And I know that instructor was just trying to discipline them, but there's a fine line between discipline, you know, and still having that openness where a child will, you know, not be afraid to come in. I don't want my students to ever fear me, right? Like that would be one of the most horrible things ever. I want them to respect me, but not more than, you know, just as much as anyone should be respected. And if they have questions, I want them to be able to ask me questions. And you know, I don't want to ever respond with anger towards them, even however frustrating it can be, right? So like I say, I teach them jiu-jitsu, they teach me patience.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking of things. So another situation, coaching at tournaments. I mean, this is different from everything else we've described so far, right? In all of these other examples, the goal of coaching has been to learn and to help people learn. In a tournament capacity, your goal is now to help people win. And that's quite different, right? The dynamic is very different. You now have this, you know, there is now another party involved. There is the opponent, right? And the opponent's team. Matt, this is an area where you have a lot more experience than I do. So tell me about this. You know, when you're dealing with coaching at tournaments, how does the situation differ?
I mean, it's something that I actually struggled with a lot. Not going to lie, for the most of my journey, I've not been a good coach at tournaments. You know, giving instruction that I look back on, and a lot of the times I cringe. I find just like teaching kids, coaching at tournaments, sometimes in terms of instruction, especially during the match, less can be more. Usually when I'm competing, I only want to hear a few things from my corner, and that's going to be how much time's left, what are the points, you know, and then some small little adjustments. One thing I don't want to ever hear or say is, go for the arm bar, or, you know, you got the ankle lock right there. You know, it's like, unless you're literally playing a mind trick with your opponent, you're kind of telegraphing the play, right? So,
and really, like, if your guy doesn't know that to go for the arm bar, like, you probably messed something up in training months before, right? You know, by the time you get to that point, that person should have enough knowledge and enough experience that they can do the stuff on their own, right? The purpose of coaching should be additive. It shouldn't just be to parrot things that are probably going through the person's head already. Yeah. But that's part of what makes coaching hard, is like, what value can you really provide? The guy, you know, you're not the one who's got someone trying to break their arm, right? You know, you're the one sitting on the sidelines. You've got the easy job. So what value can you really provide to that person on the mat with an active competitor who's trying to beat them?
I guess the main thing you can kind of break it down into 3 sections as a coach. There's going to be the pre-competition, you know, instruction leading up to the competition, all the stuff in the gym that you do, plus the game day, how you're going to get your students' mindset right for competition. And that comes with, I find, you know, if you're not an experienced competitor, it's pretty hard to relate to somebody who's going into a competition, tell them how they should be feeling. But things like, you know, don't be too nervous. Don't be so respectful of your opponent that that you're worried about what they're going to do to you. Things like this, you know, get ready for the next match. Don't blow all your load in one match. Get ready to fight again. Be happy to fight again. Look forward to the next fight, rather than just saying to yourself, "Oh my God, I want to go home. I want the stress to be all over," right? Because that's a losing mindset for sure. So there's the pre-competition mindset. There's the during the competition coaching that's going to happen during the match, and then there's going to be the follow-up post-competition coaching where we're going to debrief. We're going to talk about things that were done well, things that were done wrong during the matches, things that we can improve upon for next time. Because if you don't have those 3 stages, you're missing opportunities to improve from mistakes and whatnot. So And then, during a match, usually the only things that I usually talk about are score, time, basically things that are relative to alignment. And a lot of the time I think, what would Rob be yelling at me right now? Most of the time he's yelling me to get my toes live, right? And even up until brown belt, I'm finding myself competing and I hear him yelling, live toes, man. I'm like, oh man, geez, I'm a brown belt. I should know this by now. And having a coach that's receptive to little details like that are super important. And like I said, having a coach that's yelling at you to go for the Kimura is not necessarily great coaching, right? The information needs to be concise, it needs to be effective, it needs to be swift, and it needs to really relate to the most necessary task at hand needed to win the competition. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the best goal is stay low, stay tight. You got 20 seconds on the clock. Just kill the clock. Mm-hmm. Like that, so a coach that's at a tournament that understands how the game is played instead of looking at jiu-jitsu as a fight is probably the more effective coach, because it is played like a game at the highest levels. It's not necessarily the most dangerous grappler that wins a competition. It's the one who knows how to play the game. So if you have a firm understanding of the points and of a strategy as a coach, you could probably give a lot more better information to someone in a competition than someone who's got a bunch of street fights, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a totally different style of fighting that's really important to understand. And then as a post-competition instructor, when the matches are all over and maybe your student won, maybe they're lost, if they lose, it's going to be easier to find things that they did wrong. If they blow through all their opponents, then there's going to be less to learn because they had such an amazing showing, or all the students that they fought sucked. If you want to put it that way, it's going to be harder to find mistakes. But it's always important to think about, even when I've won competitions, I've come right off the mat and then Rob instantly started telling me things that I did wrong. And I'm like, wow, that's, it's kind of hard to hear right now because I want to hear praise. I want to be validated. But at the same time, like, that is what really makes you learn, is having those things pointed out to you. And, the last thing I can recommend is always try to get your matches on tape. That's one of the best things you can do as a competitor, is watch your own matches, especially when you lose. If you're losing competitions and you're not filming yourself and watching tape, you're missing out on crucial, that's a really big opportunity to learn. And for God's sakes, get two different people to hold the camera and to coach. You do not want your coach yelling instructions into a camera. That competition footage will not age well.
I saw some amazing tournament footage a while ago where the same guy was coaching as was recording, and he was just screaming into the phone, and like the audio was going out. You couldn't hear anything. It sounded like static. It was just absolutely brutal.
Yeah. And from a competitor point of view, just on a side note, there's things that you want your cameraman to think about. So, whenever someone films my matches, I always want to make sure that they have an angle where the referee's table or the judge's table isn't really obstructing your vision. And also things like, don't stop filming until someone's hand gets raised so that it doesn't get stopped partway through. Just little things like that. It's pretty easy to make mistakes when you're trying to film matches. So if competition footage is valuable to you and you want to put your stuff out there on social media, definitely consider how your matches are being filmed. And like I said, get your coach to be separate from the cameraman.
One thing that I really took out of this conversation is that the coaching that you do at tournaments does not just mean the coaching that you do while the match is happening. There's a significant amount of prep that you do beforehand, and there's a significant amount of debriefing that you do after, with the intent of improving for next time. And this reminds me of the conversation we had in past episodes about Kaizen, the process of continuous improvement, where regardless of whether you had a good day or a bad day on the mat, you talk about what went well, you talk about what didn't, and you work on improving. It's not about wallowing in defeat or celebrating your victory every time you compete. It's an opportunity to get more feedback and to use that to get better next time. So I really like the example you gave about how you step off the mat and you won, and rather than having a big celebration, you're immediately having the same conversation you would have had even if you lost, which is how can I do better next time? And I think that's not even just for jiu-jitsu, but for any endeavor in life. That's such a fundamental mindset to have if you want to improve over time.
And I think competitors put a lot of emphasis on, I got to win this tournament, I got to win this competition. And of course, it should mean a lot to you if you're a serious competitor, but there's always going to be more tournaments. There's always going to be more competitions. And you're only really remembered for your last tournament, unless you're just some big shot who wins every time and you're expected to win. So more importantly is moving forward the adjustments that can be made in competition, because that really is the most realistic feedback you will get is competing, and being able to take the knowledge that you get from the last tournament and applying it moving forward is going to be super beneficial for anyone who's serious about competing.
So I guess one other thing to talk about is teaching seminars. How do you convince a bunch of idiot white belts to pay $150 to watch you do arm bars?
Seminars are really fun, and I get a really big kick out of doing seminars. And I guess we'll discuss this more when we're talking about actually building your brand and building jiu-jitsu as a business and how you can acquire seminars and things like that. But, like I said before, I basically try not to be an ass. I try not to embarrass myself, especially when I'm at another school. I want to portray myself. It's a presentation. Even when the seminar is not going on, one of the worst things you can do is not be sociable. I've been to certain seminars. I go there and the guy's just sitting off to the side on his phone, doesn't say a word to anyone, and then the seminar starts and he starts doing his stuff. I like to talk to people. I like to, every time you go to a tournament, every time you go to a seminar or you go to a visiting gym, you're marketing yourself, and you're networking, and that's a really important thing if you make your money through jiu-jitsu. So when I go to seminars, I want people to leave thinking not that they, I want them to learn. I want them to come away thinking, hey, Matt's a really cool guy, or hey, he's good at teaching, he's good at whatever that he taught, but he's also a really cool guy to be around. I think I'd like to go train with him sometime, or I think I'd like to maybe have him at my school for a seminar. Those are the kind of little hidden secrets that will get you that will get you well known and will get you possible seminar opportunities in the future. Not just, I'm here to teach a class and then I'm going to go.
So one time I went to a seminar hosted by Carlos Gracie Jr., which is a pretty big name to have at a seminar. And they left 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. So we finished the move that we're showing. And at the end, we start at the Q&A. And the first thing that Carlos says is, okay, so ask whatever you want, but let's not talk about jiu-jitsu. I don't want to talk about jiu-jitsu. We can talk about that anytime. So ask me about anything not related to jiu-jitsu. And it's like, well, great. I dropped all this money. I'm sitting here with this dude. What am I going to ask this man that has nothing to do with jiu-jitsu? Like, what did you have for breakfast? What was the last book you read? Like, it was really, really weird.
He was trying to get all personable, but really it's like, dude, we're here to learn jiu-jitsu.
Don't get me wrong. It was a really good seminar, and he was actually an awesome guy, but I just thought that was so funny.
Great. Hoist Gracie wants to kill you now.
Hey, if Hoist Gracie wants to come on this podcast and talk about mental models, you are more than invited. Please come on this podcast and talk about mental models and why we're wrong. So whenever I'm in a situation where I'm teaching to a group outside of the norm, I kind of look back at what's worked for me in the past when I've been to seminars and what hasn't. And some people, when they do seminars, they want, their thought is, well, I want to show something new that you've never seen before. So they show some weird, exotic, low percentage technique that no one's ever going to use. And, it's just that you don't really get anything out of it. So whenever I'm teaching to a new group, I try not to go down that road. What I prefer to do is pick some very basic fundamental concept that people probably haven't thought about in the detail that they need to think about, that has made a big difference to me. And then I focus on that instead of any particular move. I mean, to give an example, Matt, one of the more recent times when I taught outside of my school, all I did was I talked about like the elbow-knee connection. And I talked about that for like a whole class because there's enough there that applies to different areas of jiu-jitsu that you can just walk through that over and over again. And I'm pretty sure that most people haven't thought about it in depth to the extent that we did that day. So that's kind of the approach that I like to take, rather than trying to drop some weird exotic thing that you're just going to forget about as soon as you leave. I try to come up with something that is fundamental, but maybe from a different lens than what people have thought about before.
Yeah, no, and teaching at seminars, I mean, some people, they do, it's like 2 hours of instruction, and then it's a pictures, and then, you go. I like seminars much more where usually you roll at the end or have a chance to blow off some steam, because I find the worst thing you can do at a seminar is learn for 2 hours, sit there, and then you don't get to train. Right?
Yeah.
So it's really important that you get that physical output in there as well. And usually during the seminar, when I teach, I like to show a few drills and make sure that people get their bodies moving. I don't like seminars where you're just sitting and watching and then just trying. I want people to actually get involved and be able to do some drills. And then I like to add some live elements too. So maybe we'll do, like, let's say it's a leg lock seminar, we'll do leg pummeling, and then we'll go live from that position, just getting the inside position for, 5-10 minutes. And then people can get warm that way, and they get a deeper understanding of the concepts behind leg pummeling. And then when I move on to the next step, even if they're brand new to leg locks, they understand certain things that they need to know as a foundation before we move on to the next step. And also knowing, it's just like teaching adults or kids, knowing when to scale things back and when to not teach too much. That's something that's actually the biggest challenge as an instructor that I have, is teaching less, because you want to teach as much as you can, but in the end, it kind of spoils the presentation if you do that. Yeah. So it's important to really focus on, like you said, the basics, and focus on being a little bit of a minimalist, and then definitely always giving people the opportunity to roll at the end, I think is really fundamental.
Yeah, this is something that at seminars is often a kind of a challenge, is that there's so much information presented that none of it really gets retained or used. And when I go to a seminar, I would rather cover one thing that I'll retain and use, rather than cover half a dozen things that I will immediately forget. Right? And the problem is, in order to retain and learn one thing, you need to go super in-depth in that one thing, to the point where some people in the seminar might not like it. But it's a matter of, like, what do you like versus what do you need? A lot of people hate, like, drilling the same thing for 10, 20 minutes, but the reality is you're going to learn a lot better if you do that, rather than having, like, just a smorgasbord of random techniques. It's much better to pick one thing and deep dive into it, even if some people in the class don't like that approach. Granted, you want to kind of play the crowd and you want to give people what they want, but you also want people to understand that they're going to learn more if you can deep dive into a single thing. And it's hard to do. I mean, I remember at the last seminar that we did with your instructor, Matt, it was like a 2.5 hour seminar where we did one move. And I thought that was awesome. I really like that approach. On the note of rolling after a seminar, I get why a lot of people don't do this. A lot of the seminars I've been to recently, it's like you cover a few techniques, you bang out some reps, and then you're done, and there's no rolling. And I understand why they do that, right? When you're paying a lot of money for a seminar, some people might get testy if they're paying to basically roll. I understand that. But the reality is, number one, ultimately, we're training jiu-jitsu, right? We should be rolling. Number two, this is a great opportunity to get some kinetic experience with the move that we just practiced. Right. And number three, this might be the only opportunity you get to train with some of these people. And I'm not even talking about the person doing the seminar. Usually, when you have a seminar, that means that you're going to get guests that you don't normally get. This might be the only chance you get to train with some of these people. And getting exposed to new ideas and new styles is one of the best ways to grow. So really, I think that when you go to a seminar, getting the opportunity to roll with all of those different people is probably just as valuable as whatever they're teaching at the seminar itself.
Mm-hmm. And one thing Rob does before every seminar, whether it's the a leg lock or no-gi de la hiva or whatever he's teaching, he always starts off clarifying posture structure base, so that everyone in the room, if he has to spend 5 or 10 minutes going over it, he will. By now, almost everyone in the area has heard of the system, but just to explain the language he's going to use, like frames, wedges, levers, all those things, because that's going to help him pass information throughout the whole seminar when he uses this type of language. So it's really important to get everyone on the same base, so that when I say posture, everyone knows I'm talking about the alignment of the spine. When I say base, everyone knows I'm talking about, how I'm connected with, to be able to get hip movement with my connection to the ground or my opponent, right? So it's important to clarify language, especially when you teach conceptually like Rob does.
I like how at that seminar that we did, the first thing Rob said to the group was, okay, does everyone know about my posture structure base shit?
And everyone's like, yeah.
Yes, we've heard this a million times.
Yeah. But that's good though, because now they're so sick of it that they can't help but understand it.
Yeah,
so at least they know it, right?
Yeah. Cool. So just to quickly recap, I think that was a really good chat about coaching. In terms of the topics we covered, we talked about going from practitioner to coach. We talked about teaching class. We talked about one-on-one instruction. We talked about coaching children. We talked about coaching tournaments, and we talked about teaching seminars. In terms of the mental models we talked about beginner's mind, meaning being open and receptive to new ideas, approaching every situation as if you were a beginner, especially important when you're the instructor. We talked about psychological safety, meaning making sure that you have an environment where people are willing to open up and ask questions and challenge you and not be afraid of reprisal or being made fun of. We talked about how you should respect people over positions. It's more important to respect people at a human level than to get caught up in authority or rank. We talked about incremental learning, meaning, breaking down knowledge piecemeal and giving people knowledge when they're ready for it rather than trying to cram it all in at once. We talked about learning styles, especially important if you're doing one-on-one instruction, understanding that not everybody learns the same way. We talked about the golden rule, meaning treat others the way that you would want to be treated. Very important always, but when dealing with children, it's important especially because you need to empathize with what it's like to be a child and understand why they might be acting the way they are. And we talked about Kaizen, the approach to continuous improvement, where regardless of whether you win or you lose, you go through the same loop. You measure what you did, you get feedback on what you did, and you analyze how you could be better for the next time. I think that was a really productive chat, Matt. I got a question here that we can talk about.
Yep.
So we were asked by a new blue belt, what are some mini games that can be played to quickly develop my game? For example, grip fighting games to get and remove grips. What other ways can I build a foundational strategy so that I'm not trying to do random techniques, but instead working a consistent game with clear objectives?
Well, if you're going to look for games and little games and like micro battles that you can use to sort of program yourself, I'd recommend checking out what Rob calls Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu, which is basically target sparring, except somebody puts a handicap on themselves. So for example, if I'm doing Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu and my goal is to get better at active basing and keep maintaining top position, then my opponent, I'm basically just going to walk into my opponent's guard, let them have the guard of their choice, let them have grips of their choice, and let them try and sweep me. I'm not going to go for submissions or passes. I'm literally just trying to base out and prevent my opponent from sweeping me. So and you can check this out on YouTube. It's on the Rob Bernacki Online Academy. I'm sure there's tons of footage out there of Rob explaining what this is. It's basically just a target sparring where we remove a portion of the training so that you maximize the repetitions with in a live scenario, but you're target sparring it in such a way that you don't have to worry about getting submitted or anything. Like, for example, another one is if you're doing guard retention. One thing Rob does is you'll be on the bottom maintaining guard, and the person on top is trying to pass your guard, and all you're allowed to do is guard retention movements. So you're not allowed to grip up and put your opponent in lasso. But what you are allowed to do is as they try and pass, you're not allowed to make grips, but you are allowed to do hip escapes, inversions, top stepping, any type of guard retention movement, and as a result your guard retention becomes a lot better, and focusing more on that rather than focusing on sweeps and submissions. So you're really just taking a target sparring scenario and maximizing the repetitions in a live setting. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, we're essentially talking about training handicaps here. If there's something that you want to focus, the easiest way to do that is to remove all of the other aspects of jiu-jitsu so that the game you're playing only focuses on that. An example that I like to do, because I feel that most people neglect the engagement phase of guard. They just, most people don't really play the grip game intelligently. To give people a chance to play that, one thing I like to do is have my guys, start from guard, and rather than focusing on, normally the way that people do guard drills is as soon as someone passes or sweeps or gets a submission, then you reset. The way that I like to play it is as soon as someone gets their grips and is able to hold those grips for like 3 seconds, you reset. And by doing that, by basically removing passes, sweeps, and submissions so that the only thing in the training scenario is grip fighting, it forces people to engage in that capacity. And that's a good strategy if there's something that you specifically want to work. Just create a rule set for jiu-jitsu that removes everything that is not what you want to work on.
Exactly. It would be like I want to work my engagement phase from the seated position, and then we just go live. Well, what if my opponent immediately passes my guard and we just keep going live? I'm not going to get any grip fighting training out of that. Now, if he passes my guard, or if he's not allowed to pass my guard and we're literally just fighting for grips or whatnot, then we're going to maximize the repetitions of getting grips, seeing what happens when I grab certain grips, seeing what reactions I can generate by doing certain things. It's going to be much more concentrated, pertaining to my goals of the engagement phase rather than, basically just sparring, right? So I think that Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu is a really great tool to use, and can be used really well as a warm-up as well.
I think the name's dumb, but other than that, I think that another thing, though, that we need to caution is you want to make sure that whatever drills you're setting up here, whatever training programs you've got, you want to make sure that you're not removing or altering the rules of jiu-jitsu to the point where you're going to get bad habits. Like the most common example I can think of is how everyone starts on their knees when rolling. It's hey, look, I mean, I get it. I understand it. But the reality is you're creating bad habits that are unrealistic for actual sparring, right? I mean, at the bare minimum, if you want to play that game, I suggest at the bare minimum start from like the Ali Inoki position where one person is on the ground and the other person is standing up. That I can live with because at least that could actually come up in a combat scenario. But with both people starting on their knees, like, come on, yes, you've removed some aspect of the game, but you've done so in a way that's actually probably going to hurt you in the long run. So just be mindful of that when you're kind of altering the rules of the game to target spar. Understand that it's possible to do that in a way that might help you in one place but hurt you in others.
Yeah, great point, Steven. Was there another part of that question that we needed to address?
I think that was it. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you again, guys. Great talk, Matt. This is probably going to be the first part of a longer series where we talk about kind of the aspects of coaching and team building and gym building. I'm thinking that, this episode we went pretty in depth about coaching. I'm thinking that the next one we'll probably talk about a more broader concept surrounding how to build a quality team. And then after that, probably at least one episode about the aspects of starting a gym and running a gym as a full-time business.
Cool. Can't wait, guys. And keep your questions and comments coming. Really appreciate the support.
Absolutely. Take care.